In this video lesson, we'll learn about complex numbers. So first, where do complex numbers come from? What are they? It's very important to understand, before we get to complex numbers, the square root. So for example, the square root of 4 is 2, because 2 squared is 4. The square root of 1 is 1, because 1 squared is 1. Similarly, the square root of 0 is 0, because 0 squared is 0. But what is the square root of negative 1? Well, the problem is that if you square a number, a real number, then it's always going to be positive. So it seems like the square root of negative 1 should not exist. Well, doesn't exist is not quite the right answer. The square root of negative 1 is not real. It's not a real number. But there's a class of numbers that are called imaginary numbers. That is, the square root of negative 1 can be labeled as I. And I is the number, so that I squared is equal to negative 1. It's not a real number. It's not 0 or 1 or a decimal. It's just I. And that's the only way to really understand it. And you can have 2i, and you can have 3i, 2.54i, any sort of multiple of I. That's called an imaginary number. It can also be called a complex number. But about the distinction, I'll talk about later. So now we have just I, and I is the square root of negative 1, and we can square it and get negative 1. But that's not the only combination possible. We can have 2 plus I, and we can have 3 minus 2i. We can have any sort of real number plus any sort of imaginary number. We can have I with any coefficient, 1, negative 2, or any number, really. And we can have any real number, just 2 plus I, or 2.71828 minus 3.14159i. Any number is allowed as a sort of combination of a plus bi, where a and b are real numbers as we usually think about them. And this is called a complex number. And it's specifically a complex number because it's got a real part and a imaginary part. But we can call just plain imaginary numbers, which are I or 2i or half an I, we can also call them complex. But there really are strictly imaginary, and there are strictly real numbers. And when added, you get complex numbers. So what does all this mean? Well, (3 minus 2i) is an example of a complex number because it's got an imaginary part. Negative 2 is the imaginary part, is what we call the imaginary part. We omit the I. We don't care about the I because we're referring to it as the imaginary part. We know that in the number, since it's the imaginary part, we have to multiply by I. And 3 is the real part because there is no I by the 3. And note, there's no way to actually subtract the 2i from the 3. That's just the way you write the number 3 minus 2i. Now what happens if we take the square root of negative 9? Because we started with the square root of negative 1 equals I, but the square root of negative 9 is also the square root of negative number and shouldn't exist. Well, inside of the square root, we just factor out the negative 1, and we get square root of negative 1 times the square root of 9. And the square root of negative 1 we decided will be called I. And the square root of 9 is of course 3. So you just get 3i. Similarly, the square root of negative 2 is equal to the square root of 2 times negative 1, which is the square root of 2 times the square root of negative 1. So we get root 2 times I. So the square root of any negative number is going to be a multiple of I. And that's it. I hope this video lecture was helpful. Thank you for watching.